Greatness is a transitory experience. It is never consistent. It depends in part upon the myth-making imagination of humankind. The person who experiences greatness must have a feeling for the myth he is in. He must reflect what is projected upon him, and he must have a strong sense of the sardonic. This is what uncouples him from his belief in his own pretensions. The sardonic is all that permits him to move within himself. Without this quality, even occasional greatness will destroy a man.
Hello and welcome back to Rehydrate. This season we'll be reading and discussing Frank Herbert's Dune. This is Season 7, Episode 3, The Banquet, covering Book 1, Dune, chapters 13 to 16. The hosts have varying levels of knowledge on this book and this series. My name is Dan, and I have only read up to this part.
My name is Talia. I've read the entire Dune series, albeit a long time ago, and I am rereading along with the podcast, and have also seen the movie, although nothing we discuss today will be in the movie.
My name is Priya, and I have also only read up to this part, and I have seen the recent movie.
My name is Amin, and I have only read up to this part as well, and I have seen the recent movie, and a while ago I had also seen the David Lynch version, which I don't entirely recall.
All right, and so we did have some follow-up, and I think it's from Talia?
Yeah, sure. Just to expound on what I said in the intro, this is the banquet scene. You may also remember it if you've read it as the very awkward dinner party scene. There's a lot of discussion about this in online communities and probably real life communities, just because it's so much subtext. So we don't delve all the way into that, especially in the summary, but we can link a Reddit post for people who take a pretty good deep dive into it. And it's pretty much spoiler free. It says spoilers, but it's only for the chapter itself. And as I said, this scene is not in, I think, any of the movies, certainly not in the 2021. I mean, do you want to take us to the new characters?
The new characters we're introduced to in this section are Lingar Butte, a water shipper, Asmar Tuek, who's referred to as Tuek, who is a smuggler who controls fast ships for a price. There's the banker, who's an agent with the Gaiety Prime speech pattern and financial advisor to the Water Peddlers Union. Still suit manufacturer colluding with the guild banker, and the still suit manufacturer's daughter, who is brought along to aggrandize the banker and seduce Paul.
Which one was had the stupid nickname Susu? Was that was the daughter, right?
No, the daughter queued that up for the banker.
Was it the banker or the water shipper?
It was the banker, because the banker says, like, oh, well, I'm the financial advisor to the Water Peddlers Union, so they call me Susu. Like that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, let's jump into the summary.
Sure. Hawat delivers 2 pieces of information to the Duke. First, he relays a Harkonnen note confirming what Mapes revealed. There is a betrayer inside the House Atreides, someone close to the Duke. The Mentat suspects the Lady Jessica. Secondly, he delivers a film clip analysis of the Fremen religion, recalling that when they arrived on planet, the Fremen shouted the term Mahdi at Paul. The term follows a Messiah tradition about the child of a Bene Gesserit. We flash to Paul watching the clip himself, but the Duke chooses to instead focus on Hawat's other message. He confides in his son that he does not, and has never doubted, Jessica, but will act as if he does. He hopes to trick his enemies into believing they have made him turn against her. He asks Paul to tell his mother if he is unable to. Paul hears the unspoken train of thought, that the Duke will be dead before he can reveal the truth himself. We also learn that the spice melange, when ingested, acts as natural immunity to common poisons. In the Great Hall, the Duke abolishes another water-heavy tradition of sloshing water on the floor, and rebukes a water shipper to diversify his portfolio, as water will one day be common. Jessica diplomatically smooths the incident by stating their ambition to gentle the climate of Arrakis. This statement catches the attention of Kynes, the ecologist, who seems to speak to Jessica in code. While making rousing speeches to his officers, the Duke mystifyingly smashes his own water on the floor, impelling his company to follow. All follow suit, but Kynes cheerfully secrets away the water into a hidden flagon. Kynes is not the only one with hidden talents. Jessica calls upon her espionage training and detects linguistic idiolects in the guild banker that out him as a Harkonnen agent, throwing into jeopardy the neutrality of the Emperor's Guild. Paul catches on to something amiss, and decides to verbally, and somewhat physically, joust with the banker. Paul's challenge to the banker emerges subtle alliances, with the banker and his companion on one side, and the ship smuggler, the water shipper, and the ecologist on the other. The banker sneers that the Fremen drink blood to survive in the desert. Kynes coolly responds that the desert Fremen use all the water in a man's body. At this point, the Duke also catches on to what Jessica and Paul have respectively noted, that Kynes' attitude changed when they spoke of terraforming Arrakis. Paul assumes his father's seat at the table and draws out the tensions in the room, as the banker and the smuggler have locked horns about which of them have water control, and Kynes is concealing his own knowledge of water. Kynes intervenes before violence breaks out, and no one is certain that it would have, least of all Paul himself. But nevertheless, the dinner party draws to a close.
All right, so maybe we just start with first impressions of this section. I can start since I'm fresh to it. Yeah, the dinner scene was really awkward. I'm surprised that like it's such like a famous scene and like so loved. I mean, it was fine, but it just kind of struck me as like kind of just drawn out. I was actually more interested in like the first part where they actually go out and they talk about the still suits and everything.
Mm-hmm.
They actually like and like the Duke, it seems like really in control, right? He's like he's like flying the helicopter or the plane or whatever it is. He's like trying to ingratiate himself to his troops by like they ask like, well, who gets the bonus for spotting the worm, you know, because the Duke did it. And Duke's like, you guys just split it up, right? And then like he was really concerned about like losing the people, you know, saving the people off of the spice miner. And then later on, like yeah, like you mentioned in the dinner party, like he gets away the tradition of the wasting the water. I still don't get why he like dropped the water on the floor after that. I guess
With
we can
all
talk
of
about
our
that later.
traditions, right? Like he saved the
Yeah,
guys in the water in the spice trawler, and that was like breaking tradition because I think before
yeah,
they've been all about profit, and then he has this whole performance with the water. Definitely a lot about traditions and bucking them.
yeah. But it seems like I mean, like I think there's like a passage in the book that he like that Kynes even like was starting to like warm up to him, right? He's like, oh, I think I like this guy. Um, so like he's like building alliances with the Fremen, right? So that's what it seems like to me. So he seems like you asked the question last episode, like if you think he's doing a good job, and I think like this reinforces that he is. You know, he's really trying to uh, like win people over to his side through like his actions and not treat them like the Harkonnen did. To me, like the first part of this section was more interesting than the second part, and that second part was not interesting, but that's how
Cool.
I felt.
I agree with that, Dan. But you just said something and made me think. So you said that he's doing these things to try to win people over to his side. Do you think he's doing those things to do that, or do you think that's just who he is and that attracts people?
I mean, my impression is that he's like established himself on this planet, right, as like the ruler, and like he thinks he won't be able to do it without like the native population, like because like it seemed like the Harkonnen ruled out of fear and force, maybe, right? Like that's the
Mm-hmm.
impression I get, that like they're like that beat him down, right? You know, they're begging for water. You know, they get like the rings of a towel, like that's the most that they'll get. But you know, Leto is trying to lead by more example and like being like a real leader and you know saving the people and giving them money and you know saying, hey, you guys can have water whenever we're eating, you guys can come and get water.
Well, don't you think, not to jump in too much, it just reminds me of the quote that Priya read at the top of the episode, like the sense of the sardonic? Because I feel like, I think the Duke is a good person and also is likable because he attributes it all to, like, well, I have a good propaganda core. I have a
Mm.
good campaign on my behalf. He's a bit sardonic and about, like, he doesn't take himself that seriously, but he does have a propaganda, and he even talks about, like, Paul, it's really important that we distribute film, and like I have Spice Residue, we're producing our own film clips, and then he remarks like, how will the people know how great I am unless I tell them? But he also puts in the work. Like, he doesn't just say you should love me. He does suffer through this dinner party.
Yeah.
um, he says it and he advertises. That was my take on it, but I could definitely be wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I was thinking to where the sandworm was going to attack and he like saved all those people. I got the sense that even if no one was there watching him, that still would have been his disposition.
Mm-hmm.
So but I agree. I do think some of it is marketing, or and not in a cynical way, but some
Yeah,
of it is for
it's
appearances, and
called
some of it is
statecraft.
and some of
Yeah.
it is who he is. So
Yeah.
yeah, I was just curious.
So I was kind of extremely thrown when he just dumps the water onto the floor because it's in stark contradiction to him ending that tradition of having the water that's fallen onto the floor being soaked up with rags and then that being given to the beggars. Because when he stops that tradition, you think he's being
Like magnanimous and
very gracious
yeah.
to the beggars and understanding of their need of water because he's like, oh, any beggar who comes during this time will get a full cup of water. And then in just moments later, I mean, in terms of within that same night, rather, he just drops water onto the floor. It's not even like water that has like cleansed people's hands. It's like perfectly good, clean water. And
Yeah.
I just feel like that it's one of those moments that shows us that like him, despite his desire and his hope to do well, he has certain he has moments where he's not that great of a character and perhaps not as noble as he would want to be. Yeah, that definitely threw me, especially because the whole chapter and the whole book so far is constantly telling us how important and sacred water is. Just the act of doing something like that seems very disrespectful to the place that he has constantly been up to this point trying to respect.
Yeah, and I think all the guests were even like thrown by it too, right? Everyone's like, so do we need to do that too? And even that one that the scene of that one guy like pouring it in his jacket. Uh that was
Yeah,
pretty
my
funny.
favorite part about that scene is that they said like Kynes is completely unembarrassed, just utterly unembarrassed when everyone else who's like not native to the planet is like more moved by politics. Like, oh, okay, the Duke did it, so I have to do it. And Kynes is
Mm.
like, water, I'm not going to throw that away, no matter
Right.
what. Like, I'm not going to be ashamed of it either. So that was, I think, a very interesting. I think there were actually a couple funny notes in this chapter, which I didn't get until my reread, but that was one of them.
I mean, Kynes has the most extreme take or extreme language rather surrounding the waste of water. Like at one point when Paul asks if there are plants down in the desert, he refers to plants as I think water stealers.
Oh, that they're like predatory or they're like
Yeah,
in competition with the humans.
exactly. And
Yeah, about that.
there's so much language that he uses. He calls Paul and the Duke water. They have water
Also,
fat
fat
flesh,
flesh.
as
Oh
if
yeah.
they're
That term will come
gluttons
up again.
simply. Yeah, simply from for being well hydrated. They're gluttonous in his eyes.
I also like the one anecdote of when Paul like mentioned someone was drowned. They're like, "What?" Like
Mhm.
they died because of
Yes.
too much water? That's crazy.
And then Paul later has to explain like drowning is when you are immersed in
Yeah.
water. And then a boat is
Yeah, it's like
a
out of science
vessel.
fiction. Like,
Yeah.
oh, what a cool thing to invent.
A boat travels upon a body of water, and like these people's minds are just blown that bodies of water exist for boats to travel upon.
I think also, but I think one thing that is also interesting about this entire section was the kind of the in the beginning of the section, they're talking about when Gurney gives Leto the note that he found on the Harkonnen guy that
Hawat,
they
but
found.
yeah, the
Oh, the
mentat.
Howitt, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he gives him that note, and so like that puts it in his mind that like, oh, like his consort
Mm.
Jessica's gonna betray him. It's like now it's like all these things like in motion of like trying to kind of show that he or to pretend he doesn't know, but kind of give hints. I don't know, like the whole subtext around like all of this whole chapter was
What do you
that part
think
was
of
pretty interesting.
their very awkward dinner party interaction? She like wears a dress that he likes just to annoy him, and
Yeah.
he's like, "Oh, it's good that she's frowning, even though it makes her look ugly, because it will stir up rumors that we're actually fighting."
Yeah, I mean, like all that stuff, and like when he mentions to Paul that he's telling it, like it's a
Mm.
super secret, but like he needs to tell Paul because he knows that it's not her, but he wants her to eventually know and say something in case something happens to her that he knew all along that wasn't her. Uh, yeah, that was really
Yeah,
good.
I wonder if that's because it's already been revealed that like Jessica doesn't have this perfect truth sense. She can't always tell when someone's lying, and Paul, I think, can, or like can more than she can. Maybe going along with that is that she doesn't have the perfect ability to deceive either. So if she did know, she wouldn't be able to put on,
Yeah.
quite the same act.
Yeah, I think he says as much that, like she wouldn't be able to like might not be convincing, right? If she was telling that lie.
Yeah, we haven't really seen it on display. I think we've mostly seen Jessica like discovering other people's deception, not Jessica trying to deceive anyone. So
Yeah.
I guess we only have his word.
As an aside, I also thought there's this one character who's constantly asking for recipes. I feel like he was plucked straight out of Foundation.
Yeah, that was pretty
Totally a
funny too.
character that Asimov would throw
I totally
into a
forgot about
random dinner
that.
party.
Yeah.
I must have the
I
recipe.
must.
And Jessica
I
Yeah.
was like, I'll
know.
see to it that you get the recipe.
It's so
Yeah.
Bartleby the Scrivener too. It's so formal. Like, oh, I must have this. I must have that. What is this? Wine? I must have that too.
Right.
Talia, you can spoil this for us. Does this character come back later?
He's the hero.
No, I'm serious. Like, is this a plot point that
This
we
is
should pay
not a plot
attention to?
point.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I've never seen this person again.
In the end, he throws his own dinner party and he makes all the recipes by hand himself.
Exactly.
Right.
I would love that. If
Yeah.
only Brian Herbert had written something as beautiful as that, I would have read the spin-offs. Not too late for you two, though. Amin and Priya, you guys should spin that off once at the end of the season.
We can start writing some fanfic.
It writes itself. Yeah, there's definitely more exposition of the Fremen religion, and I think that's really interesting to me. And I wonder if it's sort of intentional that the character who's sort of commanding in this section, the Duke, sort of like skirts away from that and is like, no, I'm going to focus on this plot and the betrayer and my consort. Whereas Paul definitely is curious, and obviously Hawat is collecting this. For me, like that was the most interesting and, I don't know, seductive part of beginning to read Dune, is wondering what's going to happen with this prophecy and this religion.
I think for me, I'm not super into the religious and like prophecy part of stuff. I'm more into like just the political stuff, but between the groups and like like the fact that there's all these Harkonnen spies and like they need to like find them out, and like like they said the Harkonnen guys stole the carryall that was going to save the people from the thing, and then they found him, and you're probably and like they keep saying over and over, we're gonna kill all the Harkonnen people on here, which is also pretty bold. Like they're all the same kind of a little bit out of character. Like the dude who's gonna find him is gonna kill him, like not take care of him or deport him or whatever. But like he's gonna kill him.
Set kinds on him. He could do it.
Yeah.
Just ice someone, or the Arrakis equivalent of ice.
There's another part too that stuck in my mind when I think when Paul was talking to Kynes later on, asking like if there's enough water on the planet, and Kynes is like maybe, but like Paul knew he was lying. And there's just I think like last time we talked about like the weird phenomena of like drilling and like some water coming out and then stopping. So there's definitely more going on to like the short supply of water on this planet. Then I'm sure we'll find out more about that. Like it seems like more someone's controlling it somehow. Unnaturally, like something is happening. Like that people are actually like and on purpose like short supplying the water so they can they can control it. Same as like the spice, right?
They're shorting the market. They're shorting it.
Right. Like intentionally, inflating demand because they're like holding back the water.
Definitely something fishy is going on, and I tried to write about it this way in the summary, but it's like, to me it went down in tiers. Like Jessica first notices something, and then Paul notices something, and then finally the Duke notices something, and none of them are quite able to suss it out in that scene, but they're definitely all on the same page, especially by the end, that like there's more than meets the eye. Like Kynes turns to Jessica and says, do you bring the shortening of the way? And she says that translates to Kwisatz Haderach, but they never get a chance to talk about it.
If you guys remember, I started, or rather, I mentioned last episode that I felt like Jessica was sort of like the star of the chapters that we read in that section, and in this one, I really feel like Paul is, because I feel like we get a deeper sense of his sense of morality and also his truth sense and his wisdom in a sense too, because I was just constantly, um, like, tuned into the comments and observations that he had to make in any given scenario, and it's like Kynes is there to remind you, like, "Oh, this kid is asking the more adult questions and, seems to have, like, a wisdom about him that the adults do not have," and one of the things that he says that fascinated me, also kind of to piggyback off the topic of like this sort of contrived scarcity of water that seems to be suggested is when someone talked it was the duke who said, why don't you guys just get rid of the worms? Haven't you guys thought of a way to get rid of the worms? Like this I believe it's almost like after I believe it was after um Kynes explains that like there is really no way to destroy a sandworm, and the way that you can destroy one is like, doesn't it involve like placing explosives on like each individual ring on its body?
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and then he's like, "Oh well, why haven't you guys figured out how to destroy all of them?" And then Paul has this insight that the worms are connected to the spice, and he feels that if the worms didn't exist, maybe the spice wouldn't exist either, which
Hmm.
was fascinating to me, that this force of nature that that stands in the way of extracting all the spice you could ever extract is also kind of possibly maybe the reason why the spice is there in the first place. So I don't know, that was a fascinating idea to me.
Speaking about the contrived scarcity, if you remember at the very end of the chapter, I think it's the Duke is pushing Kynes like, well, what does stand in the way? Like you talk about all these theories, like the law of the minimum and that which is the most scarce, controls the growth. And he's like, no, brass tacks. What do I need to terraform this planet? And Kynes actually produces a number, and he actually says the number is like 3%. If 3% of the plants can be, changed in some meaningful way. And that tantalizing number is like cut off, but it reminded me, especially in the reread, of the 3.5% rule. Do you know it, or what our audience, or should I just give a
Please explain.
Yeah, I don't know.
overview? Yeah, it's difficult to prove, but the 3.5% rule posits that no government can stand up to that share of the population mobilizing against it.
Hmm.
So, put another way, a revolution succeeds if 3.5% of the population are for, revolution for change.
Ah, that's interesting. I I didn't know about that.
Ask the classroom to estimate how much of a population is needed for a revolution, you'd get numbers above 50%. But
Right. I would
yeah,
guess much higher than that number as well.
but it does seem to indicate that there's this really, really small threshold that needs to be reached, but there's some reason we're not there yet.
Interesting.
Look forward to the 3.5% rule. But the other thing it brought up to me was when you were talking about the worms and the spice and some kind of relationship, slight tangent just to something we discovered in this chapter, that ingesting the spice grants immunity.
Immunity or immunity to
Like
what?
immunity
Immunity to
from poison.
poisons.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that one of the first thoughts that you would have, like certainly that I would have, is like personal safety, relief. Like, oh, if I'm eating the spice, I'm safe from assassination. Like the person cannot be, poisoned. And what we actually hear from the Duke, like this next step from a seasoned leader, is just like, yeah, man, like we can't kill off large swaths of the population this way. Like that was an option for us on Caladan, but not that we
What's
were going
even
to do it, but just heads up, we can't do it here.
what's even more fascinating to me is that his conclusion when he says how difficult it would be to poison people, he
Yeah.
says, Arrakis makes us moral and
Moral and
ethical."
ethical. Exactly. So again, that's just a very funny take on like, hey, you're going to live longer if you take this, and you're going to be immune from poison. You're like, ah, drat, this has political implications.
It just immediately made me think of people who believe themselves to be moral and ethical because they have their hands tied as to prevent them from doing really immoral and unethical things, but because they are physically restrained from doing these things, they consider themselves moral and ethical. That's not true morality or ethics, right? When
Hot
you
take.
aren't right, when you're
Cool
not doing
temptation.
something bad because you literally cannot do it.
Well, the Duke says to hold Arrakis, one is faced with decisions that may cost one his self respect. So he has to think about these things. And I think that's something that he would prefer to never have to think about.
Right. And I think that kind of ties in a little bit to the quote that we started off with, which is that your greatness is a thing that is subject to change, whatever you consider greatness to be. If you consider yourself to be great because you are a moral and ethical person, that may not be true in all circumstances and all scenarios, and that may be subject to change dependent on the circumstances. And I guess self-awareness is what will keep you sort of sane in such circumstances.
When you said that you were more interested in the politics than the religion, I was reflecting on my notes because what interested me was the relationship that we see like more and more, but especially in this chapter, that even the political statements are reminiscent of religious doctrine. Um, like the emergence of moral decay. The Duke says, I am tired. I'm morally tired. The melancholy degeneration of the great houses has afflicted me at last, perhaps. And we were such strong people once. And that almost, I mean, to me, that sounds like both a religious speech and also like you could cut that into a political stump speech, like, oh, we used to be so great, we used to be so strong, because both have this story of moral decay that heralds a changing world order, and of that order being prognosticated by this state of wickedness or poverty, or immigrants taking your jobs, or whatever your state of wickedness is. And I did pull a couple of quotes. If it's not vivid enough in my summation, probably going to throw the actual scripture numbers in the show notes so I don't have to say them here. But yeah, like the term salt of the earth, you may have heard that before in like a work meeting. If you're going for bonus, you've probably traced it back to a disciple in the New Testament. But the full chapter, it reads, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under the foot by men." And again, in another testament of Jesus Christ, that states that like this Messiah, this Mahdi, it usually comes in a period of apostasy and melancholy degeneration. And that states the Nephite record will come forth in a day of wickedness, degeneracy, and apostasy. So I saw everything here building up to this legend that the Fremen seem to have about Paul. And they're all really feeding into it, and no one can seem to skirt it. Like the Missionaria Protectiva has done its work. It feels like just by being there, they're fulfilling a prophecy. They're not even necessarily taking these steps actively.
But I think Paul is also doing stuff that like maybe like on purpose or like by accident, like fulfilling the prophecies that they have. Like when and every time that he does anything, everyone's always like, oh, like he's fulfilling this prophecy, like the still suit thing. Like he just knew how to put it on.
Yeah, like they'll know your ways as if they're your own. They'll share your ambitions because,
Right.
yeah, it feels like the Bene Gesserits wrote this prophecy and then made people this way.
Yeah, any stories, books that have this emphasis on prophecy always fascinate me because prophecy is like the oldest theme, one of the oldest themes that we find in literature. And so often we find with prophecies that if they come true more so because of a belief in them versus the fact that they actually influence the events to come true, if that makes sense. So like the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you look for signs, you'll find them in anything. It seems like, hey, he wore his suit the right way, he has to be the guy. But then Paul also has this way, and I think it stems from his intuition of making it everyone feel around him like he has a wisdom that is far beyond his years, and that he is always clued into something that no one else in the room is. And that's probably true because of his Bene Gesserit upbringing. So
Also, his dad's
uh,
training, though. His dad says, I need
right,
to cultivate this air of bravura. Like, it's not, I need to be the best and the most
true.
sharp and the smartest. It's like, I need to make people think that I am. That's the most important thing.
Right, like going back to the quote again, how will people ever know how great I am unless I tell them how great I am? So in his own way, Paul sort of seems to do the same thing, even though a lot of
It's that
what
dual
he says
inheritance
comes.
in him.
Yes, exactly.
So what do you think? Do you think he's actually fulfilling the prophecy, or you think they're shoehorning the prophecy into what he's doing? Do you have a feeling one way or the other?
I think it's important not to forget that we haven't had any interaction with Fremen. Like, it's all
Yep.
people's telling you the things that the Fremen say and do.
Hmm.
So
Well, we've
more
had a
on that to
couple,
come.
right? I mean, like we've had a few around.
Ever like two in the same room though?
I
Is Kynes not a Fremen?
think he is, right?
He is, I thought.
It feels like
Yeah.
everyone sort of pretends
No,
he's not.
yeah, I thought he was not either. I thought he understood the Fremen and he like wanted to be a Fremen, but not
It
that
looks
he
like a
actually
duck.
was
It
one.
walks like a
He,
duck. It kills people like a duck.
Right.
but it's this time it's not an official duck, I don't think.
Didn't someone at the dinner party actually sort of like accuse him of being a Fremen, or like just, oh, like he's a Fremen? Like they said it sort of disparagingly.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of assumed that he was.
I thought they said he spent too much time with the Fremen.
Hmm.
Yeah, like he spends so much time with the Fremen, he's basically a Fremen.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah, that might be true, but I don't think he is a Fremen.
But you are right. There have been no interactions with Fremen in their natural environment so far, and I think that that's why I agree with Dan when you said that you found the part where they actually go out into the environment more interesting, and I felt the same way because this is their first real interaction with the environment, and of course witnessing the way that the sandworms can pretty much like just swallow everything in their path. That part totally fascinated me, along with this interplay between Paul and Kynes, where Kynes is constantly recollecting these Fremen sayings that would indicate to him that Paul is the Messiah that they refer to. So
I did find the quote in the interim. The quote is from the banker saying, "You've associated so long with Fremen that you've lost all sensibilities." So it doesn't really come down one way or the other.
this may be a dumb question, but Talia, can you explain the difference between Fremen and just the regular natives? Because they all seem to have the blue eyes, right?
So the blue eyes are just a byproduct of all that spice.
Okay, so everyone who lives on Arrakis, who is a native to Arrakis, has the blue eyes, not just the Fremen.
Are there natives that we've encountered who are not Fremen?
Well,
I mean, people live there, right? Like,
Kynes is not a Fremen. We just established, but Kynes has the blue eyes, and there are several.
Yeah, it's from the diet. It's not genetic.
hmm.
Okay, so it
Not a
has
dumb
nothing to
question at
do with
all.
whether or not you're a Fremen, because I think that bit confused me. I thought that Fremen were the natives and that they have the blue eyes, but it seems that Fremen are a
Both
specific
true.
type of people, and not all natives are Fremen, but all natives have the blue eyes, including the Fremen.
Well, I think it's just unavoidable. They say like, "Oh, it's interesting to have these Caladan dishes. I must have the recipe." You get so used to the spice and everything. So I think if you're on planet, you just spice is like in your coffee, in your food, in your drugs. It's everywhere.
Does the book explain to us so far what is the difference then between just anyone who lives on Arrakis and Fremen? Because I seem to have missed that.
I don't think so.
I thought that
Nothing.
those were the same, but you might be reading more closely than I am. I mean, I think there's the native population, and then every time there's this changeover, like, the emperor sends in his goons, and new people come and live on the planet, get the blue eyes, and either stay or leave. Yeah,
Oh, I
that was
see.
my take on it.
Okay. So Kynes, if he's not a Fremen, is not native to Arrakis.
Could be. He works for the emperor
He works for
directly,
the
right?
emperor.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe he was sent there, and he seems to have like a very specific job, the
Yeah, he's a
planetologist.
planetary ecologist.
Yeah.
Although he
Got
doesn't
it.
seem to be like, he specifically has been told to ignore certain things. So, everyone seems to have their own game.
Wasn't there like a bit about like how the Fremen actually move through the desert? Like they can move like super quick or something? I think they mentioned that.
Yeah, that's when
When
Paul identifies people running away from the site where the sandworm came in and destroyed everything, and he noticed their movement patterns were a certain way to avoid disrupting the sand, I guess, in a certain way, as to prevent the sandworms from detecting their motions.
Yeah, they talked about like the drum sand, like where it's like if they
Mhm.
move over it, like they can pick up the vibrations.
And there was also, in that moment, also Kynes was fascinated that Paul was able to readily identify the Fremen.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So it goes both ways. Like, they can identify him, that he can like tie his still suit, and he can identify them at the same time.
And yeah, I thought like overall, like the going back to like what Priya mentioned about the sandworm part, like the kind of build up to that, I thought was like really good. Like the suspense of like, oh, we're gonna see a sandworm finally. Like,
The
what's that gonna be
sandworms are
like?
awesome.
Yeah, but we didn't see much of it, right? We only saw like the mouth opening and swallowing it,
I
swallowing
think they
the
were hinting that people who see much of them don't tell a lot of stories.
right. And it's also interesting, like it seems like the planet is like unexplored mostly. They talked about like the southern
Mm.
deserts being like unexplored, but they have like planes and helicopters or whatever.
But they
I don't
keep
know.
saying that they don't, though. Like, last episode, Fifi was saying, like, satellite control is too expensive for us. And, like, how expensive is it? And he's like, yeah, he was just telling me it was too expensive for us. So, like, there's something about long distance observation that they don't seem to have yet.
But like they definitely have helicopter or whatever Lita was driving. They call it like what was it? It's kind of ornithopter or something.
Ornithopters, I think.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's a helicopter or a plane or combination or whatever it is. So
I
they
thought
have
that was
those,
more
right?
local, like a helicopter, not like
Yeah. So maybe
circumnavigating a
they can't
planet.
just can't go far.
Yeah.
But then also, Kynes is hiding a large water reserve, so they maybe they've been discouraged
That's true.
from doing
Yeah.
more exploration as well because they can't find that.
Yeah, it could be like a story that they tell to keep people away. Like, oh, don't go into the
Right.
southern one. Yeah. That's where
Yeah,
they
definitely.
but they also have like spaceships. That's how they got to the planet, right? So theoretically they just orbit around the planet and take a look at it.
You would run the planet differently, I can tell, Dan. They set you up.
Exploration, that's the primary goal, to, like learn the lay of the land.
We'll see.
Talia probably has all this stuff, like wants this bursting at the seams, wanting to tell us all the stuff that happens.
No, I like reading at this pace. The first 3 episodes have been really interesting, and I think it's really good to get into the suspense.
I feel like I'm dying all the time because I want to talk about the scenes that overlap with the movie, and I can't because Dan
That's because of
watched the
Dan.
movie. That's all
Yeah.
because of you, Dan.
Oh, it's like a
Dan decided
buzzkill.
arbitrarily that he was allowed to watch 5 minutes.
I
Not,
know.
but not 6. 6 would be cheating.
Yeah. I also watched, Talia, you mentioned the mini series. I watched like 5 minutes of that too. And it's
Oh, I
like,
thought you were going to say like 5 episodes. No,
no,
5,
no.
5
I think
minutes of the
I,
first episode.
there was like
What did
there
you
was
say?
like
I don't remember it. And I'm sure Amin doesn't either.
I mean, like it was definitely like special effects of his time. I think it was like from like the early 2000s or around that. So you can definitely tell.
You can't watch it sober in 2022. That's not fair. That's like, Tiger Woods going to play mini golf. You got to give it some. But what was actually happening?
They got it was just like the introductory setup, same thing. I think they started on the spaceship, like they're already on the way. They didn't have anything on Caladan, and
Wow, there
they're on the
goes episode
spaceship.
1.
And then they had the scene of like the ringing of the 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 washcloth. They had that part, and like
Oh, cool.
they're telling them like we're not allowed to do that anymore. And the person got annoyed that she couldn't sell the
Your true
the
life,
water
yeah.
anymore. Yeah.
There's definitely this, like, attitude that the Duke has, yeah.
It's all this big ecosystem of people making money off of water, it seems like.
Exactly. The Duke is like, "Oh, it's like a straightforward morality thing. Depriving
Right.
people of water is bad, therefore I'll stop it." And then someone who is deprived of water is like, "Oh man, I'm really injured by you not depriving people of water because even though it's an unjust system, I can, skim a tiny little bit off of the top by
Right.
selling to people who are even worse off."
Yeah, so I wonder if like his plans of like
Politics,
making
man.
all these big changes are gonna like kind of backfire against him because like the
He's a
people.
pretty moody dude in this chapter. Keeps brooding
Yeah.
on death.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if that's like foreshadowing. Keep talking about his death. I mean, and I think there was that prophecy, right, that he's not going to live that long. So it seems like he's not going to be around for too much longer. And he's, Paul seems to be ready to kind of take the reign. He's already at the head of the table, already like leading the dinner party.
I mean, yeah, exactly. Well spotted. He quite literally assumes his father's seat at the table. I think it's some contrivance, like the security notice comes in right at the end, and he's like, "Oh, Paul, take my seat at this dinner table in front of all the officers and look like the
Right.
Duke." And then
He should have handed him a torch when he was doing it.
oh, exactly. Just to really put a bell on it.
I also love how eagerly Paul steps into that role because he sits down and he immediately then after his father leaves proceeds to tell a little story about like just to take a jab at the banker.
Yeah.
Oh my
He tells a
gosh.
story
I was
about
hoping you'd bring this up. Keep going.
Yes, he tells the story about about a man who's drowning in water. This is where the whole like he has to define the words drowning. And he describes that, a man who drowned was found with wounds on his shoulders that indicated that another man had sort of stepped on his shoulders to stand to raise himself up above the water to prevent himself from drowning. So he said that he's like, and then no one understands the point of the story. So when someone asks him like why, the banker I guess, why is this interesting, he says, well, because of something my father said about it, that it's understandable when a man who's drowning does this, but it comes across very differently if someone were to do this in the drawing room or at a dinner table. So that was just like Paul really getting super cheeky, and even Jessica remarks on it like in her mind that like, okay, that was really bold and probably unnecessary.
Bold and
And
unnecessary.
yeah. So it seems like he's really like there are times where you have to question like, does he have the capacity to lead the way that the Duke does? Is he quite ready for it? Because yes, he does have this plethora of wisdom and quips, but does he really have that leadership skill to pair with that wisdom and quips, if that makes sense?
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, it seems like he's not quite ready to be a leader and like bring people together like the way like the Duke is trying to. And maybe like he's a little bit arrogant because of his powers.
I'll just underscore that Paul Atreides is a teenager.
Right.
Obviously, he's like close to an adult because the stillsuit manufacturer's daughter was brought to lure him with sex. So obviously, he's like a man, but he's a teenager. And I thought the only parent of a teenager on the show could tell us, should teenagers rule planets?
Absolutely not. I mean, maybe like an 18-year-old or whatever, but like definitely, I don't know how old is Paul?
Dan, how old's your daughter, Dan?
She's 14. She's
So
definitely
she's almost Paul's age,
okay.
ready to rule.
Is Paul 15? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no.
It's a resounding no.
In the year 10,170 something, but he is still 15.
But yeah, I don't know. Maybe like the different teenagers have different, like people. I guess there are there are like really responsible teenagers and like teenagers that are already leaders at that point. They're doing a lot of things, but like that's pretty much the exception, right? I mean, Paul maybe is the exception here, but he has all special powers. But he also has like a teenage brain. So
Right, and earlier in the book, didn't he say he was burdened with terrible purpose? I think he was
yeah,
still going through his emo phase, so
I think
Oh,
he said he didn't want to go to the dinner party to start with, right? Like, and then when it first started, I think he said he didn't want to be there.
hmm.
yeah,
I
that would
feel like,
make sense.
but Jessica is the one leading that whole thing up. She's like, this is the best way to ingratiate yourself with the officers, like engage with them socially. Like to her, that's obvious. Like when the Duke is like, huh, why would I even invite a smuggler? I'm gonna ask out loud. And she's like, in case we need to get the hell out of Dodge. What do you mean why? Like
Yeah.
it's good to have on hand. Better to have and not need. Like the political context of this dinner party is very clear to Jessica
Yeah.
in ways that maybe are not to a teenager. But thank you for your unique opinion on it, Dan.
I just want to say that I think what makes the dinner party scene interesting is that all the other characters are kind of there and they're having their own antics. And at moments, you also get like little excerpts of like conversations that they're having, little snippets, little quotes. And most of the topics of conversation between the dinner guests are all like very surface level and superficial and like, talk of recipes and different fabrics and stuff. But then your mind remains focused on this interplay that's happening between Jessica and Paul, this nonverbal interplay. And there's so much happening non-verbally at that dinner scene that like Jessica and Paul are picking up on because of their truth sense, and then there's also Kynes picking up on his own observations of the royal family, or like the Duke's family, not the royal family. Are they the royal family? I don't know.
They're noble born,
The
right?
Nobility.
noble family.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of I just find it fascinating when characters are able to sort of focus in on one another's body language and take social cues that are nonverbal and make really sound conclusions or not so sound conclusions based off of that. So I found that interplay between these three characters very fascinating because they seem to be the most perceptive of all the characters, and everyone else is just sort of background noise at that dinner party.
Yeah, Jessica was ready for action there. She had her hand on the knife and everything. It was like she was ready to go.
Right?
But it was also fascinating how much control Kynes has over this situation in many instances when he doesn't actually have the sort of powers that Paul and Jessica possess, but just this ability to still command a situation and still take back control over a situation or to diffuse a situation, makes that character very interesting to me. I think in conclusion, we should probably, if unless anyone has anything else to say, in conclusion, I think we should maybe bring it back to the quote that we began with. And if if you all have any particular interpretations of the quote based off of the events of these chapters, I think in part we touched upon it earlier in the episode as well. But any like concluding thoughts on that?
For me, it's all about the sardonic, separating yourself from your own pretensions.
So I actually found a great analysis for this on Reddit that kind of sums it up. Someone was asking for the interpretation of what that quote means, and someone just simply wrote, "It means sometimes people fall for their own bullshit, and it ends up biting them in the ass," which is pretty much what I think about that quote as well. But if I want to get a little bit more sophisticated than that, I would say that the way that I understood the word sardonic, um, as used in the quote, is kind of like a healthy cynicism, or rather being cynical towards one's own sense of greatness and deriving from it a keen awareness of the impermanence of that greatness. Because I think it's very fitting, where you chose to end us off in terms of the reading section for this episode, because it ends where Jessica notices Paul being kind of boastful. And in her thoughts, she cautions he shouldn't boast. No person who will be sleeping far below ground level this night as a precaution against lasguns has the right to boast. So it's almost like that Icarus myth again, like fly too close to the sun and you're going to come crashing down. And I think that that's the essence of the quote, that you'll reach a peak in your greatness, and unless you're self-aware, you're not going to last very long in that place.
That's a million times better than I would have interpreted that quote. So I will leave it there. Yeah, thanks for listening. Please check out rehydrate.space for release episodes in the reading list. Leave comments by emailing us at rehydrate@fastmail.com or on Twitter at rehydratepod. Please join us next episode for Season 7, Episode 4, covering Book 1, Dune, Chapter 17 to 23 of Dune by Frank Herbert.